Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside Intelligence. I'm Michael Ard, Program Director for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis degree at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm very pleased to welcome Alex Vatanka to our program today. He's the Director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He also specializes in Middle East regional security. He's a senior fellow in Middle East studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School, and he teaches at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Alex was born in Tehran. He holds a BA in political science from Sheffield University in the UK and an MA in international relations from Essex University. He's fluent in Farsi and Danish and is the author of 2 books, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979, which was published this year, and also Iran and Pakistan, Security, Diplomacy, and American Influence. He's presently working on a 3rd book titled Iran's Arab Strategy, Defending the Homeland or Exporting Khomeiniism. We welcome Alex, and today, Alex, we'd like to thank you for coming. And to kick us off a little bit, I said permanent crisis in Iran's foreign policy. I sort of took that from your book. That was what struck me as a big theme there. And maybe we can start by expanding on that a little bit. Do you think it's a permanent crisis?
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for that introduction. And it's great to see you again and be with everyone. Looking forward to our about an hour that we have together in the conversation between you and me, and hopefully the questions we'll get. Michael, in terms of a permanent crisis, I think if there is a permanent crisis in Iran's foreign policy, and I think a lot of Iranians believe that is the case, certainly since 1979 and the revolution that created the Islamic Republic, how do we break that permanent crisis down in simple terms? And I think the simplest of ways of explaining that permanent crisis is the fact that successive successive Iranian presidents, but let me put the Iranian presidents aside and say since 1989, and argue before 89, when Ayatollah Khamenei, the current supreme leader, became supreme leader. Before him, for 10 years, if you remember, there was another supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini. So these 2 Iranian supreme leaders, unelected as they are, because the Iranian people did not choose them to be where they are, these 2 unelected officials, Khomeini from 79 to 89 and Khamenei from 89 to today, have over the years, 42 years to be precise, put their political interests, their very narrow political interests, which is about survival at the very minimum or maximizing power at best, above the national interest. So if you are, and this is one of my takeaways from the book that you kindly just mentioned, The Battle of the Ayatollahs, that was my takeaway. So I kind of look at everything that has happened over the last 42 years in terms of big ticket foreign policy issues, from the hostage crisis when the US embassy was taken in November of 79, to the Iran-Iraq war, to how Iran dealt with the end of the Cold War and arguably missed a great opportunity to readjust its position on the world stage when that opportunity was there, to the last 2-3 decades of this permanent crisis evolving over Iran's nuclear program. I mean, right. To me, what is clear throughout is that they have put their political interest over the national interest. For example, and I'll stop there, Michael, because I want to hear your reaction to what I'm saying. It might be controversial, but there is no good argument to say today that not talking directly to the Americans in Vienna is good for Iranian national interest, right? Right now, as we're waiting to see if these talks will resume in Vienna, if they resume, and if they continue to be following the pattern of the last 6 rounds that have happened in the last few months, what happens is the Iranians will talk to the Russians, to the Chinese, and the Europeans, and those countries will then go tell the Americans what the Iranians are saying. And the Americans will pass the message on and so on. I mean, this is just petty politics. And this is what Iran has been insisting on. Now, I am not going to get into, at least not right now, in terms of who is at fault. Was it President Trump's fault to walk away from the nuclear deal and create this crisis? And one could make the argument that is the case. But nonetheless, here we are today in October 2021. The Iranian economy is massively sanctioned. They desperately want relief. They want to get things done differently going forward. There was one solution to that, arguably more than anything else, which is to open up and have a frank, to the extent that's possible, conversation with Americans. And what are they doing? They rather not have that direct conversation. It's politics. It's about politics in Tehran as opposed to pursuing the national interest of Iran and therefore delivering for the Iranian people. I think that's the tragedy of Iranian foreign policy. And I think that is, use your words, permanent crisis. I think that's not way off the mark, describing it a crisis. It's not a crisis for the leadership because they're behind it. It's a crisis for the people of Iran who are paying the consequences of the foreign policy choices of those unelected officials at the very top of the power pyramid in Tehran since 79.
And it seems more driven in some ways by ideology than realism, or if that's a fair statement.
No, I mean, look, I would say it's been an ideology that you could even make the argument that we are where we are based on a lot of choices and accidents over the years. I mean, let's go back to 79. Here in the United States, we love to understand 79 because it's a pivotal moment in not just US-Iran relations, but in America's understanding of its role on the international stage. When Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran in February of 1979 as this great leader of the revolution, he had hardly really articulated much about Iran's position to be after the Shah vis-a-vis the United States. There is no hard evidence to suggest that he was to his core anti-American. He had made some remarks about Shah's relations with the United States, and that is certainly true. But there was nothing that was guaranteed that he would be anti-American, that the regime to follow after the Shah would be anti-American. And I don't want to bore everyone so I'll be very quick in retelling this event, but who was the most anti-American element in Iran at the time, 1971? It was the left, communists, the ones who looked to the Soviet Union for inspiration. And Khomeini, for political reasons at home, approves finally of a group of radical students taking over the US embassy because he felt if he wasn't ahead of the curve, ahead of the masses, who are very much oftentimes influenced by the left, that he would lose his position as the father of the revolution. So it wasn't so much ideology as such. It wasn't that he had sat there and spent years thinking about why we need to break relations with the Americans. It was because in that particular moment, November of 1979, he had to worry about the left in Iran, and nothing to do with the United States. And one could argue, and I'm sure people might have some issues with what I'm saying, but the US becomes the accidental or the victim in all of this. I say this, and I think it's true, but we also have to remember the United States was a pivotal power behind the Shah from 1941 to 1979. But I think this ideology has certainly evolved. And if in 1979, the slogan of the revolution, Michael, to your question about what is this, realism or ideology, in 1979, I remember when I was a young child or young student, one of the slogans they forced us to chant was, neither east nor west, we will go the independent way. I mean, it doesn't rhyme so well in English as it does in Persian or Farsi. But the point was, we're not going to be the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. We're going to go our own separate way. Fast forward 42 years. Who are the two countries that are keeping this Islamic Republic arguably alive? China and Russia. Mm-hmm. So we have almost come full circle here because the anti-Americanism is there still. To some extent, anti-Westernism is still there, part of the worldview. But Russia and China increasingly seen as saviors. And you can't explain that by sort of saying this is ideological. It's not ideological in the sense that it's not Islamist. It's not what Khomeini promised in 79. It's ideological in the sense that it's what the most common denominator Iran shares today with Russia and China is that fear or anti-Americanism. That's what they have. But that's a very different ideology if you compare it to 4 decades ago. So in other words, this ideology is not set in stone, it's keep evolving, but one permanent part of it has been fear of the United States and the West, which the ruling elite in Tehran constantly have to worry about, and they are the reason why you don't have better relations between, for example, Tehran and Washington today.
Right. And we had opportunities, or I say we, but what I mean is there was in the 90s, for example, opportunities to perhaps open discussions on normalization, correct? That was occurring back. There's been peaks and valleys in this relationship.
Right. Look, I mean, Michael, when I go back to my research for this book, the time where the U.S. was most serious about getting over the embassy crisis was during the Ronald Reagan administration in the mid 80s. That's where you really sense there's a push in the Reagan at the White House, because the Cold War was still going on. Iran is simply, as a real state, too important to ignore. And the Reagan administration, people like Oliver North, made the point to the US Congress later on in the hearings that followed when Iran-Contra affair became a reality. They said, look, Iran is simply too important. But once the Cold War ended, Iran's value drops massive. So it comes to the 1990s with the Clinton administration. Iran wasn't being seen in the context of an important potential piece of real estate, if you will, or a country that you want on your side, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But it was increasingly being seen as a spoiler in what the Clinton administration at the time had in mind, which was this: following the first Gulf War, the Arab-Israeli peace process needed to be pushed forward. That was one of the promises made to countries like Egypt and Syria and so on to get him involved against Saddam. And the one country that was sort of pushing back against that was the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so Iran goes from being, something that you cannot afford to lose to a country that you should contain or isolate or punish. And I think that policy really starts with the Bill Clinton's first administration. That's when you see the first big set of sanctions being imposed on Iran. I mean, we talk about maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, but remember the big shock to the Iranians in terms of sanctions, which by the mid-1990s became the what was then known as the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. That happened on Bill Clinton's watch. But Michael, you're right in the sense that same President Clinton does in his second term, seriously push the idea of looking for a way to talk to Iran. I mean, we just had an event at the Middle East Institute. Our colleague Ken Pollack, who was in Clinton administration, he reminded everyone on that call that Clinton had been warned. Look, this is going to be tough. This is not worth your political time. Don't do it. But Clinton said in his second term that no, I really do want to look for a way to end the enmity with the Islamic Republic. It didn't happen. A lot of it, I think, is to do, as I tried to explain in the book, that the Iranians have never been able to sit down and comfortably among themselves and say, let's talk to the Americans, because they're constantly bickering among themselves, and that factional politics makes it impossible for them to come up with a consensus position on what to do with the United States. So if Mohammad Khatami wants to talk to the Americans, or Hassan Rouhani wants to talk to the Americans, the supreme leader gets nervous because he thinks US embassy opening up in Tehran will mean he will have less power. And that's the tragedy. But Michael, final point, I said, the US too hasn't really had a consistent position on Iran, to be honest. I think, we might come to a position soon with this new the US and China, battling it out on the global stage. We might go back to a return to 1980s, where the United States simply cannot just ignore Iran and have a policy that is basically sanction them as much as we can, but that's about all we do. I think the US will soon be forced to think out of the box. Sanctions alone is not going to be good enough. And that's my guess in terms of what to expect going forward.
Great. Let me take a step back for a moment. First, I do invite our audience, give a question in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll have time to get to your questions. One thing, let's step back for a second, Alex. Let's put ourselves in the Ayatollah Khamenei's shoes and look at sort of the challenges they've got as the Islamic Republic, bordered by several countries. Now you have the Taliban back in Kabul. You're looking across the Gulf at the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. You've got potentially an anti-Iran faction has won in Iraq. There's a lot of tentative situations going on in his immediate neighborhood. So how do you think that he's looking at the region right now and prioritizing his challenges?
Well, I think clearly what they're doing is to separate the talks in Vienna on the nuclear front from the regional files. So, for example, when countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE have been asking the West, principally the United States, to make sure that when you return to the talks with the Iranians on their nuclear program, that you insist that they agree to making concessions on the regional files at the same time, simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Iran has said no to that from the beginning, and I don't think they're going to change their position. So what they are trying to do now, and this is simply my, if you will, humble reading of the situation, the region sees the United States, and I don't think they are wrong, because a lot of people in this country also happen to look at it the same way. The Middle East, broadly speaking, countries see the United States looking for a way out. And I think that the way we pulled out of Afghanistan is a manifestation of that. Now, if the US pulls out, you don't have that same kind of American commitment to status quo in the region. What should they do? We see a couple of trends, obviously. We see a trend where countries are talking to Iran on a bilateral level. I mean, the Saudis now have had 4 rounds of diplomatic talks in Baghdad. There's reports now that the Iranians have been insisting and might soon get the Saudis to accept opening up or reopening their embassy in Tehran.
Right.
That would be a big one. I mean, it has diplomatic relations were broken off in 2016. The Emiratis are talking to the Iranians. And I think, that those 2 countries on the Gulf side, on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, are probably the 2 most invested neighbors of Iran. You mentioned the neighbors. There are 15 neighbors of Iran. These right. are probably among the immediate neighbors, the most invested. And if they change their ways and want to sort of look for a dialogue with Iran, I think that's quite telling in terms of where they think the United States is going, because they've always relied on the US to take the lead, and they're not so sure about that leadership at the moment. But another way of answering your question, Michael, because you talked about Ayatollah Khamenei. And this is something that he inherited as a supreme leader in 1989. He could have chosen in the last 30-some years as a supreme leader to go in a different direction, but instead he doubled down. In 1979, when Khomeini came in, the region as a whole was nervous. The region as a whole had never seen an Islamist Shia revolutionary model. This was a new phenomenon. So, but countries out there in the region were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But very quickly they started getting nervous, because Khomeini talked about going out there and breaking things up and reordering the region in a new way. And countries like Saudi Arabia were labeled as lackeys of the West and so on. So they created a lot of the suspicion that exists to this day in 1979. My point is they've had plenty of time to sort of change course, to reassure neighbors that Iran, for example, is not hell-bent on exporting its revolution at any cost to places like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region. But as we've seen in places like Iraq and Syria, the Iranian model of operation has, if anything, made some of these neighboring countries like the Gulf states even more nervous, and not to mention the Israelis that slightly a bit further away, but still worry about Iran's regional agenda. I think Ayatollah Khamenei, if he wanted to take a look at the region, he has every right to be concerned. There are all sorts of threats that Iranian national security has to deal with. The question he needs to ask himself is, in terms of priority, what is driven by his ideological commitments? I mean, the axis of resistance, which they're so proud of, the idea of Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so on, the Hashd al-Shabi, the militias in the region. This is arguably an ideological commitment. I don't think Iranian national interest necessarily needs this so-called forward defense, this intervention on a large scale in the region to protect the homeland. What Khamenei could do is to reduce tensions with the United States, with the Western powers, with the region in a general sense. And that, I think, would serve Iranian national interest a lot more than what we've seen from Iran in recent years, which I think is really largely driven by this adherence to militant Islamism that was born with Khomeini coming to Tehran in 1979.
Yeah, one of the things that I would say would probably the thing that's making people nervous the most is what's going to happen with their nuclear program. And, we've gotten now, we understand enrichment is a 20%, so it's really not too far a jump to get to weapons grade. They've announced that, but they've also announced that the IAEA can come in and restart inspection regime, right? Really, I mean, the question now is, okay, where are we going with this? Are we going to, I mean, how many said publicly, that we would not build the bomb?
Right.
Right. And so but what's the trajectory on this?
No, to be honest, at this point, I always make this point. No other country in the history of man has spent this much time and money on a program if they wanted the bomb.
Right. I know. Well, that's right. Yeah. By this time, yeah, that's a question I have. And frankly, I think it's been, I don't think it's been probed enough is, look, it's been over 20 years.
Right.
And I mean, how long does it take to build it?
Right.
So well, it's right. So what are we really looking at here? And what's the end state? You made a comment earlier, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but you made a comment earlier about the sheer inability of the regime to get to a consensus on important foreign policy issues. Is it possible that we're seeing the same thing with the nuclear program?
Oh, that's a tough, important question, Michael, but a tough one. I really wouldn't be able to. I mean, I can only speculate. I mean, this program, for the sake of our group, in case somebody is not aware of it, Iran's nuclear program really begins. Well, you can go back all the way to the administration of President Eisenhower and the Atom for Peace and the first reactor that is given by the United States to Iran. The Shah wants to build on the nuclear program. The US is uneasy about it in the 70s. And, by the time Khomeini comes to Iran, he first dismantles the nuclear program because he calls it Islamic. But then during the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranians are nervous about Iraq's nuclear intentions, so they restart the nuclear program. So there's been all sorts of things going on here. And people, analysts certainly have reason to wonder if Iran has good reasons to want to have a nuclear weapon, given that they have a neighboring states, or they are in a neighborhood with a number of nuclear powered states. They have Russia to the north that's nuclear powered, or nuclear weapon state, Pakistan and India just to their east, and then the Israelis obviously have their undeclared nuclear weapons program. Others in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, have ongoing nuclear programs. So you could make the argument that they have perhaps a good reason to want to have a bomb. But to your point, and what I just said before, they haven't so far. I mean, I don't know if it's the fatwa, the religious decree that Khamenei issued. Don't think that's going to convince anyone in the non-Islamic world that just because you issue a fatwa, we take your word for it. That's just not going to be good enough. But we have had plenty of inspections over the years. And while there are some lingering doubts in terms of what they did in the past, I don't know of any evidence right now today that suggests that there's a Iranian nuclear weapons program. There's an Iranian nuclear program for sure, but there's no sign of, as far as I know, a weapons program, which brings us to the issues of what do they want? They're not creating a lot of jobs or producing a heck of a lot of electricity from the nuclear program. What do they want? Clearly, they want to be a threshold nuclear state. They have mastered it by this point. There is no bombing campaign that can stop Iran's nuclear program the way you could stop the Libyan or the Syrian or other nuclear programs. This is an indigenous program by now. They have pretty much everything under control. So you can't bomb it. You can bomb it, you can delay it, but at the same time, you might then give them reason to want to go for the bomb. And that's the big question for countries that are. For example, I guess if you're sitting in Israel today, one of the countries that is most concerned about Iran's nuclear program because of Iranian rhetoric against Israel, the question you have to ask yourself is, Israel could carry out strikes, I'm sure, limited perhaps, but could carry out strikes in Iran. But what happens the day after? Would they have ended the Iranian nuclear program? And as I just said, I don't think that's the case. So you might have just given Iran a reason to actually go ahead and weaponize. So those are the tough questions that countries in the region are having to confront, like the Israelis, like the Saudis, and the United States as well. I look at Iran's nuclear program and I see nothing but cost. I mean, in terms of what it costs the nation, direct and indirect cost. But to your point about where are they coming from in terms of how they see the world, obviously it's very difficult for me to put myself in their shoes. But if one thing that one could point out is if they believe regime survival depends on it, then they might ultimately at some point decide to go ahead and weaponize, and time will show.
I mean, it's the huge $64,000 question of the issue, and also, if it seems like it's a lot harder now than it was back when they started negotiations for JCPOA to actually get to a new agreement. I mean, that's the way it looks like right now. They've upped the ante by raising, with a higher level of enrichment. And it would seem like it would be very hard for us to get a different agreement from them at this point.
So if I was a betting man, I would say that they do want to come back. And I know plenty of people here in Washington who believe that they don't want to come back to the talks. They don't see any reason why they should return to a nuclear agreement. That might well be the case, but as I said, if I was a betting man, I'd say they want to come back to the Vienna talks. I think what they do at the same time want to do is come back with the strongest hand possible. Clearly, from Iran's point of view, and this is not a secret, they have said it repeatedly, the 2015 deal didn't work for them. Because if you ask Iran what happened in 2015, they're saying, well, we put all our nuclear concession in motion, we reduced the number of centrifuges, we did A, B, and C, and then we sat back waiting for the rewards in the sense of sanctions relief, international investors returning, and then we found out none of that was happening, that the US was still basically quietly telling everyone that, we're not done with Iran yet. So if you're thinking a big long-term investment in Iran, not right now. So a lot of European companies, for example, were very excited about going to Iran in 2015, from oil and gas industry to the car makers like, Peugeot and the German car makers. All those plans came nothing. And even US companies, I mean, Boeing eventually couldn't sell whatever it was, $100 billion worth of planes to Iran that they had signed to do. Right. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I think they want to come back to the nuclear talks, but they want to come in with a stronger hand, and they want certain sort of requirements almost met before they walk into that negotiation room. And two things stand out for me. One is, you can't sign another deal with us and then quietly behind the scenes tell international banks, for example, that, yeah, we signed another deal with it, but still don't touch Iranian money, because we might get you on we might not get you on non-proliferation issues, but we get you on human rights violations issues, or we penalize you on Iran's links to terrorism and so forth. So Iran still remains sort of you can't touch it. And that is what the Iranians fear. They want assurances. This is what they keep referring to as sanctions being verifiably removed. The key word for them is verifiably removed. That we sell the crude oil, and right away we get the money in our bank accounts, and nobody is there to stop that from happening. That's what they want to see this time around, which didn't happen in 2015. The other thing they want, Michael, and that's tough, is to sort of get a guarantee from the United States saying that at no other point in the future will the United States do what Trump did in May of 2018, which is to unilaterally leave the deal. How you can make that kind of a promise if you're the Biden administration, I don't know. I mean, my understanding of it is certainly not good enough to be able to comment, but if it's a treaty of sorts, obviously you need the US Congress involved, and good luck getting a majority for anything to do with Iran in US Congress, majority support. So
right.
That's where we are. But again, if I was a betting man, I think they want to come back. And if we have time, I'd love to, develop that idea further with you. But think about it for a second, Michael. You talked about Ayatollah Khamenei. He's 82. He wants continuity. Mm-hmm. Look at it as an analyst. You want continuity you want the succession process the day you die to be the least exciting possible. So you can predict, shape the outcome of that succession process. If that's where you're coming from, which I think most people who are logical would want to pull off a succession process, which incidentally is exactly how they did it in 1989. Before Khomeini died, they made sure they signed a peace deal with Saddam Hussein, so they wrapped that Iran-Iraq war up so they could create space for themselves for the succession process that followed.
Interesting. And that's interesting.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, and he's had health problems. It could be a case of where, yeah, I mean, we need to stabilize things. We need to get, we need to reduce the amount of areas of conflict that we have, you know, in order to make that happen properly, or else the whole project could be jeopardized.
Exactly right.
That's very interesting.
You don't want this nuclear crisis hanging over your head, right?
Yeah.
But you could make the counter argument, and I think it's tough to make that argument. I'm sure people will do, which is that this is a regime that likes to be in crisis, because that's how they can justify the most sort of toughest sets of policies being implemented at home against the domestic Iranian opposition, but also in the region. That crisis is actually their most natural way of operating. I think that's far-fetched. I really do think that if they can get something that looks like a decent compromise, where they keep pretty much their nuclear program where they are. They're a couple of months away from being able to weaponize. In the meantime, they can get sanctions relief, not make major concessions elsewhere in terms of their regional policies and so on. That's not the worst of places to be if you're Iran, certainly compared to where Iran is today. Right. So, but you know, we'll see. They're supposed to start imminently, right? These talks are supposed to start any day, they say.
Very interesting. And I have a couple more questions, and I'd like to get to our audience's questions. But one is, and I think this is the other big pending shoe to drop here, is what's the relationship with Afghanistan going to be now? I mean, here when the Taliban was considered an enemy of Iran, there's a lot of reasons for them to be nervous about them. And we just saw, of course, where ISIS blew up a Shia mosque, and that had to be taken as a very worrisome sign in Tehran. So, but maybe things have changed now, right? So, what do you think the relationship is going to be there?
So, I mean, I think the Iranians are still, you know, divided at home, but also in terms of their messaging on the Taliban. Their position is actually pretty alike to what you have out there in the world. It's just, we wait and see, and we'll make a decision based on Taliban's performance behavior. There've been a couple of Iranian senior level meetings with the Taliban in Afghanistan. You pointed out the prospects for the Hazara Shia minority. That's an issue for the Iranians, not to mention the Tajik, the Persian-speaking Tajik up in the north. I think, you know, when the U.S. pulled out, and that's a whole separate question in terms of why the U.S. pulled out the way it did. Certainly, you have, I think it's legitimate to question that. But once the U.S. was out, that Iranian narrative for a couple of days was the following. This proves that the United States has failed in the region, and the United States eventually will leave. They leave in Afghanistan, they will leave elsewhere, and Iran's, you know, message will resonate and all the rest of it. You know what I'm getting at. Within a few days of realizing, by the time the cabinet, the first cabinet, provincial cabinet of the Taliban was announced, the Iranians were started publicly saying, this is not that different from the Taliban in the 1990s that we almost went to war with.
Right.
So the irony for Iran is when Taliban were just, blowing things up, but Iran had a pretty decent relationship with the central government in Kabul, backed by the United States. That was a good period for the Iranians the last 20 years. It gave them actually political access in Kabul. Afghanistan became a pretty decent sized market for Iranian goods, somewhere like $2 billion. It's not huge amounts of money, but it's pretty still significant. There was no refugee crisis from Afghanistan, potentially hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of Afghans leaving the country over the next a few months and years, that would be a huge headache for the Iranians. None of those concerns were there just a few years ago when the US was in Afghanistan. But what did the Iranians do in terms of their position on the US being in Afghanistan? Well, they played the ideological card. Instead of looking at it in terms of actually the Americans being in Afghanistan is not a bad thing for us. It's not a bad thing for Iranian national interest. They constantly played the sort of ideological message, which didn't help the US or those people who were supporting this sort of US effort in Afghanistan. And now that with the Taliban back in power, I think Iran has very good reasons to find or believe that it's on the losing side. It hasn't lost entirely yet, but it's on the losing side. Right now, the Iranians are probably thinking that they need to start reestablishing the alliances that existed in the 1990s to deal with the Taliban. That's India, Russia, whoever they can work with inside of Afghanistan. I think that's where they are at right now. They're thinking in terms of contingency plans if things continue to go the wrong way, the way it has in recent weeks with the Taliban from Iran's perspective.
Very good. Yeah, the one thing I think this would be good, especially for our students who are thinking about issues in strategic intelligence and looking at let's say a target, as you say, an intelligence target like Iran, trying to understand it. And like say we were talking about earlier, you're an open source analyst, but how do you feel the sourcing is on an issue like Iran? How good do you think is open source material, and how accurate do you think we get a picture of what's really going on in terms of decision making there?
Right. I mean, look, the good thing about Iran and being open source analyst on Iran is there's plenty of material. I mean, this country publishes so much that you can read on a daily basis. I do. I collect plenty of material every day. When I wake up, the first thing I do is to catch up, not just in terms of what's going on in the US world, but specifically in Iran. I mean, obviously, you need that Persian language skill set. That helps. That really takes you further. But they also publish plenty in English.
Right.
But you have to just be careful, because when they're publishing English, and that's not unique to Iran, any country that runs run media publishes in a foreign language, there's a purpose behind it, which is to shape your understanding of what's going on, to give you something they want you to believe in and subscribe to. So you're going to be very careful. But what I do is I read across the spectrum. I read whatever is available from the opposition in the diaspora to political activists inside of Iran and everything in between, and obviously the regime's own narratives. That, at the very least, will give me a sense in terms of what the issues are, what the fights are about, where the key actors are, and why they have these drivers when they, for example, on the issue of Saudi Arabia, which is what we talked about just earlier. Who right now is pushing for detente with Saudi Arabia that might not have happened 5 years ago? What's the difference today? Why did the Revolutionary Guards go from being essentially the people who are behind the storming of the Saudi embassy, which was so damaging to Iran's interest,
yes,
to the same Revolutionary Guards today pushing for detente with Saudi Arabia? So you get that by reading open source media. What you don't get, Michael, and that's because I don't have access to being on the ground in Iran. I don't have access to people, and I mean, I have the option of picking up the phone and talking to people, but I don't do it just because I don't want to put anyone in an awkward position. And
yes.
I think you've got to be respectful of where they are, the limitations they have over there in Iran and countries like Iran, where the state is powerful and is the big brother watching you. But yes. I'll be honest with you, I have plenty of material to work with by just being an open source analyst that tracks events and tracks trajectory of things. What I have to be careful about is to choose the ones that matter the most for the audiences I'm writing for and analyzing. Right. Otherwise, there's plenty to do, but you just want to be selective in what is actually, when I have all this material that I can work with, what's the most important? And I can tell you right now, the Iran-China relationship is extremely important. The Iran-Russia relationship, the issue of succession in Iran is extremely important. What Iran wants to do in the region vis-a-vis the Gulf states is important. And the other most important, well, the other always important issue is Iran's position on the state of Israel, because it's the elephant in the room. It's the one issue that is constantly a factor in shaping events in the region. So plenty to work with.
Okay, great. I think it's a good time now to start getting to some of the questions from our audience. Thanks for asking them, by the way. Sheila asks, and this is a question that comes up a lot, could Iran already have the bomb? I think that's possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible, but if it is possible, it would be such a, what a blunder on the part of the intelligence services around the world. I mean, the idea that they haven't been able to detect an actual bomb, to me is unlikely. I mean, we know that intelligence services, particularly from the United States, Israel, and others, are active in Iran. I mean, Iran is one of the top, target countries for intelligence communities. That you would not have detected a bomb, but maybe you have detected a bomb and you pretend that you haven't seen it. And I don't know, maybe, I don't know what the logic behind that would be.
Right. And this is a good, it's always been considered, part of every time somebody has developed it, they've announced it, except for the Israelis, right? It was really the only country that's not admitted that it had it. In Iran's situation, it seems to me it could be a situation where they would decide we build it and then not tell the world we have it. But then what's the deterrent effect, if that's what they're trying to go for?
Yeah, but Michael, remember also, in recent years, we've seen what has, for example, the CIA and Mossad done over the last 10 years. I mean, they've been able to do anything from putting, hacking into the nuclear program in Iran. You remember Stuxnet.
Right. Yes, of course.
Now we're blowing things up. They have assassinated leading scientists, and the last one being Fakhrizadeh, on the streets of just outside of Tehran. They have, in the case of, if you remember, early 2018, Mossad agents were able to take out apparently truckloads of nuclear secrets. If you can pull these things off over the course of 10 years or so on, this is not a one-off. It suggests that there's presence, that they have ability to do things, and then they haven't got the ability to detect the bomb. It just, to me, just seems a bit
maybe, yeah. That's one where I feel maybe we're confident that that wouldn't happen without the intelligence services picking up strong indicators that it was happening, but it's still something that's out there. Right. Let's talk another question. Is in terms of, we talk a lot about Iran's influence and their activities in the region, especially working with proxies in cases like Yemen, of course. And what do we see in terms of that activity? And another question from Sheila, could something like this also be seeing, in respect even farther out from the region, like say Latin America, where we know that Iran has connections with Venezuela, Nicaragua, et cetera.
Right. Let me take the second part, Iran in the broader world. Look, I think essentially it's a reflection of Iranian lack of options, because they put themselves in a position where they have few options. And they need to look outside, and they have created plenty of competitors, rivals, suspicious neighbors that they need to branch out to look for like-minded, countries out there. You mentioned Venezuela. It all began with Hugo Chavez. It all began,
of course,
not because the Bolivarian version of life has anything in common with Ayatollah Khamenei stands for. Except one thing that they had in common. They both, for whatever reason, were resisting the United States or opposed to the United States, and that became the basis for that close relationship. It hasn't really gone anywhere in significant ways. Now, I know that, for example, we read about tankers of Iranian fuel going to Venezuela in return for gold and so on.
Yes.
But these are desperate measures, if you ask me. These are desperate measures by countries that are trying to basically survive the pressures they're under. And the question of whether all those pressures are just or not, that's a different issue. But what I'm getting at is Iran's economy is not going to be what it could be by just relying on limited trade, a barter with Venezuela or Nicaragua or Ecuador before, or when President Ahmadinejad was around, he spent a lot of time in places like West Africa. This is not about thriving, as I like to put it, but about surviving. It's not good enough. That you're not going to please the Iranian population of 85 million people. You're not going to get a GDP growth that's going to create the 750,000 jobs they need to create each year by having these mostly symbolic relations out there. But to the point about the region itself, which is far more important, Iran's immediate neighborhood, Iran has, even to this day, despite all the things that I think they've done wrong, made their neighbors nervous. They can go a different direction. They can try and reassure their neighbors that Iran is actually not any longer going to insist on exporting the revolution.
Yeah.
If they do that, I think they will find a region far less concerned about Iran's regional agenda. Iran is not, incidentally, the only country that is out there meddling in the Middle East. There are other countries that meddle. I don't want to name names, but I think we all know.
Well, yes. That's something I think that I'll just make an observation that it struck me that, especially over the last few years, we were seeing a lot of the things attributed to Iran that in the past we really hadn't thought Iran was involved with, even terrorist acts. This leads to another question. Sheila asks, could it be that would Iran give safe haven to a group like Al Qaeda?
This is a regime, and I use the word regime. I know people in the Islamic Republic don't like to be referred to as regime. They like to be referred to as government. But I think if you're not elected, essentially that's what you are. I think you get to call yourself a government if you represent the views or the hopes and aspirations of your people. And I think that the centers of power in Iran, the office of the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards, they're not elected. So therefore, I call it the regime. And the thing. The regime has right now in 2021, when I look at its options, it has the option for its own survival to make some foreign policy choices that will be very different from the ones they've made in the past. I mean, Al Qaeda question is very specific, and I think yes, if they felt a bunch of Al Qaeda senior leaders would be a good bargaining chip to have as they deal with either Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or somebody else, that they can exchange them, and they have done that. I mean, Michael, you mentioned Yemen before. Iran, for example, in both cases of Pakistan and Yemen, Iran exchanged Iranian diplomats taken hostage in return for Al Qaeda operatives, if I'm not mistaken. So
okay, yeah, right.
Yeah, but this is on a very low level. This is on an operation. This is what happens in somewhere in Yemen or in Pashtunistan between the borderline between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But what I'm trying to get to is the bigger issue of what kind of country do you want to be? That's really what the Iranian leadership today has to confront as a key question, particularly with the succession process looming just around the corner. What would Ayatollah Khamenei want to give to whoever's going to succeed him? Would he make life easy for that person, or would he make it as hard as it has been for himself? And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you reduce tensions, if you look for ways to make compromises in the region with your immediate neighbors, and also importantly, make compromises with your own people, then you give the regime a better chance of surviving Khamenei's death. So it's actually, in many ways, it's in the interest of Ayatollah Khamenei to, if you will, come off his high horse, this ideological horse, and listen to his own people and listen to the anxieties that neighboring states express.
Yeah, I mean, there's I would think too, as part of that, there must be a lot of nervousness about how easily, frankly, Mossad has been able to operate in the country to the point of, killing an important nuclear scientist who was being heavily guarded by the Revolutionary Guard, right?
Right.
Losing all that material on the information, the material that was archived on their nuclear program, and having that exposed to the world. It doesn't seem like internal security has been really up to the task.
Right.
And I would think that that's also something that they would be nervous about if there was anything to try to disrupt their succession, right? Or anything like that that might occur.
I think if you look at what Iran is doing right now in the region, in multiple theaters, investing heavily, sending Revolutionary Guards commanders to oversee operations in places like Syria. Every time you send a Revolutionary Guard commander out there, there's one less Revolutionary Guard commander to watch over Tehran should there be more protests. So this issue of, the Islamic Republic, I should say, does not have unlimited resources. And if you stretch yourself thin out there, you will be in a position where you might be taken or caught by surprise when something happens that is actually quite important to you. We talked about Taliban before. That is far more important for Iranian national security interests because it's the immediate neighboring state.
That's right.
When drops come from Afghanistan, that creates 2-3 million Iranian addicts. That's a national security crisis.
Yes.
You have to deal with that. But when you're in Syria, keeping Assad in power or deciding to deploy troops just outside of Golan so you can project power of Israel, that's an ideological decision you've made. No threat emanating from Syria to Iranian homeland today. So where do you spend the resources that you have, which are increasingly less because of the sanctions?
Right.
We had a conflict, Michael, in the South Caucasus. Now, Russia and Iran, which used to be sort of pretty comfortable in South Caucasus, have to deal with the Israeli, Turkish, Azerbaijani partnership. The fact that the Iranians last year were caught by surprise, didn't know this was coming their way, to me suggests they weren't having their eyes on the ball. And if this keeps happening to them, it's the homeland, it's the Iranian homeland that will be under threat while they're busy chasing these projects in faraway lands like Yemen or Syria and so forth.
Right, where they don't really, which isn't really necessarily their core interest. I mean, they certainly do have a feeling that we need to defend, in some sense, right, the greater Shia community in the region. But
yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, if you push that issue in Iranian public opinion, I'm sure there's plenty of sympathy for Shias in the region. But end of the day, they're suffering right now in Iran, and they're putting themselves first, I think, at this point, thinking, what about us?
Yeah.
You will not have a kingdom here. You will not have a system to rule over if you just keep spending all your energy outside. And that's a fundamental, a warning threat that Ayatollah Khamenei and whoever succeed him needs to take into account. And Michael, I just say this as well, and I don't know if we have any more time, but very quickly, since 1979 to 2011, Iran was not in the region. Iran fought against Saddam Hussein for 8 years, was in the region in a limited way, support for Hezbollah and so on. The types of things they did was not on a large scale. They were not ever engaging in nation building the way they have been the last 10 years in a place like Syria. The Arab Spring forces Iran, or Iran chooses to use the Arab Spring to go into the Arab world in a way we hadn't seen them do before. And now the question is, how long more can they stay the course? Because as the United States has just found out, and others have found out, it's costly. It's costly to be out there, particularly if you stay in a longer term. You have to spend money in a place like, say, Syria, for example. So the Iranians have won some of the key battles, military battles that were to be had and have been had in Syria. But now I think they're questioning the long-term presence and what benefits they can show for it. I think that's the big question. If they can't show any significant tangible benefits to be there, except that they can claim to be on the Israeli border and make the point that the axis of resistance is powerful because of what Iran did in keeping Assad alive. Well, that will only work for the small base that still believes in the ideology. The large population wants to see tangible benefits coming from Iranian foreign policy. And right now, there are few tangible benefits that I think ordinary Iranians can see.
And maybe that's a good way to wrap it up today, Alex. But one thing that you mentioned in the book, and I think I saw something from Daniel Pipes recently about this, was Iran public opinion, especially with respect to their religious allegiance. That it seems to be a lot of people have become so disenchanted with the with the Islamic Republic idea, that they've even left the Shia religion. And you had referred to this briefly in your book, and perhaps this is, it seems to me that's a suggestion that the project is really failing in a fundamental way.
Right. So basically, if you have the reality where people are, never mind not coming back to the mosque or entirely giving up on the religion of Islam, then something has been done wrong. I think there's a good percentage of Iranian clerics in places like Qom and Mashhad, the two holy cities, who know this reality, are uncomfortable with reality, understand that when you merge politics and religion, that oftentimes, which has been the case here in Iran, it's the religion part that suffers, because when the politicians fail, they're not the only ones that get cursed. The religion that they use to justify their actions is also cursed. So I think, it's absolutely true that the Islamic Republic is being facing pressure from very many corners. And this is just one of the corners. The younger generation of Iranians, if you look at that demographic in the 85 million strong nation, that young generation of Iranians, they are restless. They're questioning the system. They're questioning everything in terms of the traditions and norms. And you see it being expressed in this extremely rich civil society that Iran has. But all the restrictions that the regime puts on it, this is a civil society that keeps surprising them in terms of new ideas that come up with, to push back and to make sure the world knows that there is an Iran, which is very different than the Islamic Republic that rules over it.
Oh, hey, by the way, sorry, Mira, I missed this question, but Mira asks, link cooperation between Iran and North Korea. Sorry, I didn't see this earlier. Do we see this happening on the nuclear program at this point, or is Iran pretty much going on their own?
All I can tell you is there's history of cooperation. I don't know exactly what's going on right now, obviously, but if you go back to their cooperation in terms of the production of missiles,
that's right.
We're pivotal in that. It goes back to the 80s. How much of the North Koreans have helped Iran's nuclear program? I don't know. That's a great question. There isn't much material out there as far as I know. I think that is something that the intelligence community knows a lot more about.
Yeah, right.
But
it's a very interesting question. Thank you very much for that. And thanks for everybody for joining us today. And thank you, Alex, for a great talk and very insightful. We're really looking forward to keeping up with you on this. Hope to have you back. We also look everybody that we'll be back again with Inside Intelligence in 2 weeks. We'll be talking to George Fariol of the National Endowment for Democracy, who will explain to us some of the crisis that's been going on in Haiti. So we'll go from there, Iran's permanent crisis to, unfortunately, Haiti's. And I hope you can join us for that. Thank you very much again, Alex, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be with you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.